Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Decryption and I hope you are well. Many games have animals in them. Half the time they're just static, you can't really do out with them. Half the time you end up shooting them and fighting them like in games like Far Cry. Everybody will despise your game if you cannot those animals. And I am working on this tutorial game here, so I figured we need animals. And if we have animals, we need to pet. So in today's tutorial, we're going to look at how you can walk up to these lovely doggies here, pet them on the head, and then wander on with your day. It serves no functional purpose, but we know the internet's gonna love it. So let's get started. So I have my tutorial game here, and I just have my normal NPCs stood around, and yes, it might be a bit weird to have a dog here, but we don't have to have them here in the full game. Or which one of these would probably have a dog? He looks like he'd probably have a dog. He can just be laid down next to him and you can go up and pet. So we need some dogs. Now, you can use any animal for this. I'm using dogs in this example because that's what I've got. Cows, horses, sheep, cats, whatever you want. So the prerequisites is you need your dog model. Now, the models I have are actually from the Cinti pack called Polygon Dogs. As you know, I love my Cinti models. So as you can see, I have all the Cinti dogs here, and there's loads of... And the special bonus of this pack dogs is it actually comes with animations as well, which I think, honestly, is a Cinti first. You can see as I run it, all the dogs are animated. You're barking, you've got loads of different skins of dogs, Halloween dogs, robot dogs, Shiba dogs, all of them. And then you've got all the different animations. So for mine, I'm going to have the dog just sitting idly, maybe that one, wagging the tail, and then they'll lift the paw when you go to fuss them, and then you can do all sorts. If you walk up to them, make them bark, and they've got loads of animations. Look. So it's a nice little pack we can run with. And now it's not sponsored, but at the moment, since they do actually have a sale on for the next 12 days, it's currently the 4th of October, 12 days you can get it 50% off. So it's there, and it's really good. But of course you can use any of got. The prerequisites are you have a pack of animals, and then if they're rigged, it's even better for you. If they're animated, even better. But of course you can make all that yourself. So I've gone and imported these dogs into my Unreal, and you can see when I go to my models folder, that one, I've got my polygon dogs here. So I can open up the meshes and I have all my different animals to play with. Now I already have a blueprint I'm going to use for this called my blueprint NPC, which contains all my NPC data, contains their life, any dialogue they want to play, stuff like that. Because if you think about it, a dog is an NPC. And plus doing it as with an NPC gives you the option to do quests where you follow the dog and stuff. All stuff you might want to do. Or if you want to talk specifically to a dog. So I'm going to create a child class of my blueprint NPC. If you haven't got a blueprint of an NPC, just create one of a base character and use that. That'll work too. So I'm just going to come right click this and do create child blueprint class. And I'm just going to call it NPC animal. And I can open this up. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start removing things. Because you can see if I come to my mesh and give it one of the dogs, like a Dalmatian. There we go, we've got a Dalmatian. It's got hair and sunglasses and beard. We don't need. So I can't delete these because they're part of the parent. And I could go off and create a human NPC and non-human NPC. But all I'm going to do for time's sake at the moment is I'm going to select all three and just come up and click clear on them so they don't have anything there. And now with moving bits around, so like the dialogue trigger, if we wanted the dialogue trigger, it'll probably be more in the middle of them. We've got the dialogue trigger. I'd probably click the capsule collider and just make it a bit wider so we can set the half height a bit smaller. So we'll do about 44, and I'll set the radius a bit larger. And you'll see the animal isn't actually at the bottom of it. That's the bottom, and you can't move the capsule collider. So all you do is just move everything else up. If I move this up so it's just about in the middle there, you can see it's now level. If I compile and save, I can drag my doggy. Let's do it next to this guy here, because that's where I want it to be. I can drag my animal in like so, and it'll move up, and you can see it's nicely touching the floor. It looks correct. Yeah, that looks good. So the next thing we want to do is for these animals specifically is we need to give them an almost a state. So what state are they in? Because I want my dog, as you saw in the intro, to be sleeping down, and then you can walk up and awake it, or if it's walking around, it will have a state what says what current action it's taking, and then you can talk to it or have to wait for it to wake up. And this is really easy to do. So I'm actually just going to come into my blueprints, and I've got a folder called enums, so feel free to create your own. And I'm just going to right click blueprint enum or enumeration, and I'm going to call it e_animal state. And I'm going to open this up. So all an enum is basically a fancy list of items, but they're set items. Whereas if you were to use a text, a string, or a name, you'd have to hard code it in. With an enum, we can specifically add states to it. So the first one I'm going to add is sleeping trans. Sleeping trans is when they are idle and they're transitioning into being asleep. And then I'm going to add sleeping, so they are asleep on the floor. Then I'm going to add waking up, so this is you've just tried to wake them up and they're transitioning from sleeping to waking up to idle. Then I'm going to do idle, so this is them Barking, that's one for later, and that's where if you walk up to them, 50-50 chance they'll probably bark at you just to get your attention. You might miss them if you walk around the corner. And then petting. And petting is the action where you pet them and stuff like that. And that's all the states we need. Now you can add as many states in here as you want, such as walking around, belly rub, whatever else you want to do. I'm just sticking with those basic ones for me. And now I can come to my animal here, and I'm going to add a variable called current state. You don't need to tick the eyeball because we don't need it to be publicly visible, but you can compile and save. And the current state I'm going to keep as sleeping because I want most of my dogs to be asleep. And that's what state will start. Now, if we jump into the event graph here, we can delete these ones here because we don't need them. And you can see I've got an interface for can interact and interact text and interact. And this is something I've created in a previous tutorial. If you don't have it, it is simply an interface I've created called BPI interactable with 3 functions in it: interact, get interact text, and can interact. And all it does is let me create interactable objects throughout the world, such as an NPC or a dog. So I'm going to come into the can interact here, and all it needs is a bool return saying, can you interact with this creature? And I'm going to drag the current state in, and I'm going to drag off and say equals equals. And I'll say you can interact with them if they're sleeping, and I'm going to drag from this and do an or. And I'm going to drag again and do another equals equals, and say you can only interact if they're sleeping or if they're idle. So if they're barking at you, you can't interact with them until they've stopped barking. If they're transitioning between something, such as waking up or sleeping, you can't interact with them. And if you're currently petting them, you can't interact with them again. And that will mean the event tick, which fires the line trace, will carry on and say, can you interact only in these states? So on the get interact text, I'm going to drag out from here and just do a format. And this will be whatever they say on the screen when you walk up to them. So I'm going to say, because it'll say press E to, and I'll say pet, and then I want to put the name of the animal. So I'm just going to type the word pet, and in curly brace, I'm going to add the word name. And then I already know that on my BP NPC, I have a name text here, which I can use. So I can drag off and just do get name. And the text option here. So now it'll say pet, and it'll say whatever the dog's name is. You can just put the dog if you really want to. But what I'm going to do is let's give this dog a name. So I'll search for name, and I'll just call it Tifa. This is Tifa the dog. They can now see the dog is in the world, and when I walk up to them and highlight, it'll say press E to pet Tifa. And you can see they're currently playing a weird idle animation. I'm not quite sure what's going off there, but we'll ignore that. So now let's just jump back to the NPC animal here. And now the next thing we need to do is we need to overwrite the interact function. And this is the function that when you press the key to interact, it calls here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the current state in here, and I'm going to do a switch on it. And a switch is basically just a bunch of if statements, but compiled into a nice, easy state, as you can see. Now I'm going to say if you interact with them and they're transitioning sleep, nothing will happen because you can't interact with them. But if you're sleeping, then I'm actually going to set the current state to waking up. Because if they're sleeping, then you click on it, they'll wake up. Kind of like you do with Skyrim if you click on people. And I'm going to ignore every other one except idle. And all I'm going to do is if they're idle, and you click interact, then they'll start petting. And what we're going to do later is create an animation blueprint that uses this state to control what animation they're playing. And this will be sleeping, tail wagging, standing up, blah, 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 blah. So setting this state is kind of all we really need to do. The next what we need to do after this is actually create the petting functionality. And I don't actually have an animation on mine to pet the dog. So mine's just going to lean over towards the dog, go, who's a good boy, and then lean back up kind of thing. So when you're petting them, we need to think of what aspects of the game need to change. So when they're waking up, nothing happens. We just tell the dog, wake up. We can still move around, we can wake them up, we can run away if we want to be mean to the doggy. However, when you're petting them, the first thing we need to do is actually stop the player from being able to move around anymore, because they've initiated an action. So I'm going to right click and do get player controller. And from here, I'm just going to drag off and do set input mode UI only. And this is basically going to stop the player's keys from working so they can't walk around and so like so. After this, we're going to need to store a variable of the player so we don't have to keep casting it loads later when we're using it. So I'm just going to right click and do get player pawn. And remember, if this is a multiplayer game, you're going to have to change the index to the correct player so you're getting the correct one. And I'm going to drag off and do cast to my first person. And this is whatever your player type is, like so. And I'm going to promote this to a variable so we can use it again later, because then it'll save us casting loads and loads and loads. And I will call it player character. And then finally, I have a variable on my player called is busy, and this basically stops the interact menu and the line trace from working. If you don't have this, however you fire the line trace, you basically just need to cancel it. In my case, I have an is busy flag. And that's pretty much what we need to do at the stage for the interaction. At the moment, if you walk up to them, their current state is sleeping. It's just going to change to waking up. If you set their state to idle and interact with them, it will freeze your character in place and you won't be able to do anything anymore. So now let's actually move on to the animations. And the animations is what's going to trigger the changing of states between it. So from sleeping to sleeping transition to wake up, idle, blah, 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 blah. And it's really easy to do. So if you don't have animations at the moment, or you're just developing it without animations, you just need to find a way to change the states between them. Whether you add a delay node or something like that, you could create a function, change state, have a delay, and it'll eventually get to it. With the Cinti pack, I do actually have animations, so I'm going to use those. And it's really easy to do. I'm going to jump to my animations folder, and I'm just going to create a new folder called Polygon Dogs. And I'm going to right click, animation blueprint, and I'm just going to search in here for my Polygon Dogs skeleton. Here you see I've got game models polygon meshes here, and I'm going to click create, and I will call it AB for animation blueprint, and I will call it Polygon Dog. So if you've never created an animation blueprint before, imagine a graph of all your animations with logic to connect the animations together, smoothly transition between them all. That's what this interface is for. Now you could build it all into here and use montages to do everything you need. That's going to take a long time to do when this animation blueprint has everything already built in for you. It makes it really easy to do, and artists love it. So the first thing I'm going to do is jump back to the event graph here, and you see it always has a function called update animation. So this try pawn get pawn owner will basically try to get this animal here when we assign it to it. So from here, I'm going to drag off, and I'm just going to do cast to my NPC animal, and I'm going to plug it in. And then if it casts successfully, I'm going to promote it to a variable called it NPC animal, because we're going to have a lot to do with this later. If it's cast failed, it means you've attached it to something that's not an NPC animal, and then you can deal with that later. So after this now that we've got the NPC animal, we actually need to store the state of the animal inside this variable here. So I'm going to drag off and do get state, and it will get us the current state, and I will promote this to a variable, like so. Perfect. And now that we've got a record of what state the current animal is in, this is where we can start animating it. So I'm going to jump back to the animation graph in here, and the first thing I'm going to do from here is something I always do, and I'm going to create a default slot there. And all this does is allow this animation blueprint to use montages. I believe it does other things as well, but that's the reason I know it. So if I were to, for example, put this sitting bark animation here and compile it, the dog will sit and bark on a loop if I tick looping. However, in my NPC animal, for example, if I shoot something, it might want to run away and play a montage. So adding that allows it to play the montage. So what I'm going to do is delete that, and I'm going to drag off, and I'm going to create a new state machine. There we go. And a state machine basically lets us loop over all of the animations. So I'm just going to call it animations, and I'm going to double click into it. And this is where we can start creating the graph. So the first thing I want my doggy to do is sleep. Now you might want them to do something else. That's completely fine. But I'm going to drag off to the side using the arrow, and I'm just going to click add state, and I'll call it sleep. And then I'm going to double click into it again, so we're in 3 levels deep. But you can see that at the top we've got the animation blueprint, the anim graph, the animations, and the sleep state. And in here I just need an animation of the doggy sleeping. I'm going to come and search for sleep in here, and you see I've got a bunch of animations that this skeleton supports. And then I'm just going to drag in the sleep idle animation here and connect it up. Once you hit compile, you will see that the dog is now in sleeping mode because it's playing the sleep animation. The cool thing about the event graph is it shows you live in the editor where the animation flow is going. So if I come back up to the top and jump back to the animations, you can see it's hitting this node here, which is perfect. So the third thing it's doing is sleeping. So after sleeping, what we need to do is we need to tell it to wake up when the condition is met. So I'm just going to drag off from the outer edge of here, and I'm just going to hit add state. And I'm going to call this wake up. And then just like before, I'm going to double click into it. And in here, I need to find an animation that looks like the dog is waking up. So I'm going to search, look in my sleep, and I'll find I've got a transition here, and I've got sleep to sit. So this will be the dog in the sleeping position, and he'll sit up and be sat. If I wanted him to stand, I could also go to stand, but I believe I've got a sit to stand as well. And if you hit compile, you'll notice there's no exec bubbles anymore. If I jump back to the animations, there's nothing coming across to the wake up. It needs something to say go from this state to this state, and that's what this arrow icon here is for. So if I double click this, I need to give it something that says you are allowed to enter this state. And for me, I'm going to drag the current state in, and I'm going to put here equals equals, and I'll say if they are waking up, then it goes into that state like that. And I can just hit compile. So if I come across to my anim preview editor here, I can see my current state here. It's currently set on sleeping trends, but I'll set it to sleeping. And you'll see nothing will happen, even if I click apply. But if I come and change it to wake up, the dog will suddenly play the wake up animation. Awesome. If I jump back to sleep, however, nothing will happen because it can't get back. It can't do anything from here. But that's fine, because I don't want it to go back to sleep yet. So it's going to sleep, then it's going to wake up only if it's in the wake up stage. And after it's finished the wake up, I'm going to come down here and I'm then going to add another state called idle. So this wake up state is only going to be an animation, and once it's finished, we'll make it go back down to the idle. So I'll search for sitting. Have we got any sitting ones? Here we go, we've got a sitting one here. Let's see what this one looks like. So from the idle, if I come back to the animations and double click into the transition state, I'm going to grab the current state and I'm going to say equals equals, and I will say idle. So if he's currently in the idle state, then that's the only way he can move down to here. So you'll see in the anim preview editor, I'll set it to sleeping because that's where it currently is. I'll move it to wake up, which will mean he'll go across to there. Then I'll set it to idle, which means he'll go to there. And now he's just idly sat there, looking around, breathing, have a jolly good time. Perfect. So now that we've done this, the next step we can do is we can tell him to go back to sleep, and then we can go off and say he can bark from the idle stage, or we can activate the petting part. So I'll just send him back to sleep now, for now. So we'll drag across and I'll do add state again. And this one I'll call it sleeping trans. So this is his transition from idle to sleeping. So I'll double click into this, and I need a stand to asleep. And in the Cinti pack, I believe we've got one. Sit to sleep, and it is to sleep. There we go. So I'll drag this across, and then I can double click on this editor here, drag the current state on. I can say equals equals, and this will be sleeping trends, just like that. And then finally, I can drag this sleeping trends back into the sleep. I can double click the arrow and say he's only sleeping if his current state, which will update with the animations, is equal to sleeping, like so. Then you'll see I'll run it, and everything looks okay. I'll change his current state to sleeping. I'll change it to waking up, so he'll wake up. Then I'll change it to idle. He'll sit there idly forever, having a jolly good old time. I'll change it back to sleeping transition. He'll go there. And then I'll change it to sleeping, and he'll just loop the sleeping. So there's our first animation cycle. It's looking really good so far. So let's carry on with the others. So let's do a petting one, which is the whole point of this tutorial, really. So I'll add a state just down from idle, and I'll call it pet. I'll double click it, and in here we need to play the animation I want him to play when he's being pet. Now I don't actually have a fussing pet animation, but what I do have, I think it was called begging, sit begging. There we go, we'll drag that one in. And what this one will do, if I double click it, is he just lifts his paw up. We can add a whine, ooh, 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 kind of thing, just like so. Perfect. So I can jump back to animations, and from the idle, the only way we need it to actually begin petting, then we can say equals equals. If he's being pet, then he can be playing the pet animation. And I'm actually going to copy this, jump back to the animations, and this time we need to get back to the idle state. So I'm actually going to drag from this petting one back up to idle, and you'll see we'll have an arrow either way. One arrow is from idle to the pet one, and one is from the pet to the idle. So if I come in here, I can paste it in, and I will say from petting to idle is the only way you can get back, is if your current state is idle. So if we give this a go now and fast forward through, sleeping, it'll become waking up, and then it'll become idle. And then if we come and change it to pet, he'll lift his paw up, so we can, oh, oh, so we change it to petting, and then we can put it back to idle, and it'll go back. And if we really wanted to, we'd say go back to sleep, and it'll go back to sleep. Perfect. We've got an almost fully animated dog, which is really cool. The last thing I want to do while I'm here is I actually want it, so as you walk up to the dog, who's over here, if he's asleep, I don't want him to do anything because he's asleep, but if he's awake, I want you to walk up to him. I want it to like roll a 50-50 chance whether he'll bark at you to get your attention. I think that'll be pretty cool to add, and it'll add a bit more life into the dog as well. So this is actually really easy to do from what we've got already. All I'm going to do across from idle is drag across and add a state called bark, and this can be anything you want: bark, meow, moo, whatever a goat says kind of thing, you know. So if I jump into bark here, I'll search for my barking, and of course you'll have any animation you want, and he's sitting barking, not standing. Drag it in, jump back out, and then double click the barking. The only way he can bark is if we have told his animation state to bark. I'll plug it in, and then we'll jump back to the animations, and I'll drag from the bark back to idle, and I'll say the only way you can do this is if your current state equals idle. There we go. And we can easily test this just really quickly. If I go idle, and now if I hit barking, he'll go woof, 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 or something, and then he'll jump back to idle. There we go. And that, I think, ladies and gentlemen, so that is the animation graph part done. Nice and simple. So now that we've got all these animations set up, what we actually need to do is tell our animation blueprint some way to move between the states. So the sleeping to the wake up is fine. We've already taken care of that with the animal. So you come up, if they're sleeping, it calls waking up. And that will tell this to go to the waking up animation. But the waking up animation at the moment never has anything to move to idle here. It needs to be set to idle. So we need to somehow tell it when this animation is finished to do that. And the way I like to do it is if you jump into the actual animation here, you can just double click it or open it any other way. You see here, we've got the animation playing, and this is the actual animation for the sit up here. What you'll see down here is you have a notifies marker here. And on here, you can basically create a notify to say at specific keyframes, this has happened, and then you can pick up on that in Unreal on real time and tell it to do something. So it's really easy to do. So all I'm going to do is come up to the point where I want it to transition from sitting to idle. So you can see all of this at the end. And all of this at the end is just the same keyframe as him just breathing, so it should be fine. So I'll just go as close to the end as I feel. I'm going to right click on the line that says 1 under the notifies, and I'm actually going to go add notify, new notify here. And what I'm going to do is just call it what it is. So this is waking up finished, and I'll just press enter, and you'll see it's added it there, waking up finished. So if I save that now and come back to my animation blueprint, and then I can jump back to the event graph here, we can actually pick up on that event when it calls it now. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose waking up finished, and you'll see it's created an event automatically. So we can grab this, and now we know the waking up is successfully finished. I can drag in the NPC animal, and I can drag up and say set current state, like so, which is why we didn't make it private earlier. Because you have successfully woke up. And that is what we have to do for each little section. So the next section we need to do it on is the barking. So I'll double click into the barking, double click onto here. Now this one's a little bit different because we actually want to play a sound when he barks at some point. So we can drag across and you can see he'll start barking there, bark. So I want to come right here, and just as he's about to say it, I'll right click, add notify, new notify, and I'll just call it bark. And then I'm going to actually drag across behind it and copy it with Control C. I'll come across to his next bark, which is there, and I'll paste it like so. And now he'll bark and play the sound, and we can drag across one more, he'll bark one more time there. And then I can drag right to the end as it's finished, and I will right click and just say you have finished barking. So I'll say bark finished. There we are, and now I can save that. Jump back into my animation blueprint, event graph, and now I can right click and I can do anim notify bark. And there's the bark, and I can also do right click, anim, notify, bark, finished, like so. So with the finished, I'm just going to drag the NPC animal, paste it down here again to set it back to idle, and that's that one done. The barking we'll deal with in a minute because we need to set all the sounds up, so we can ignore that for now. Back to the anim graph. So we've done the barking, we can come to the pet, and we'll hit the petting. We don't really need him to do anything here, we just need to know when he started petting, which we're going to know anyway, and then when the petting is finished, we will right click and I will just add notify, new notify, petting finished. Jump back to animation, event graph, drag down here a little bit and do petting finished. And then we can do the same again where we jump it back to idle. And now that we have the majority of our animation set up, we could technically give it a try. So I'm just going to jump back to my NPC animal. I'm going to click my mesh and I'm going to set its animation blueprint. So I'll just set the animation mode to Polygon dog, like so. And I can save and compile, and you'll see our doggy is already laying down. So that's looking good so far. We can play it and we can run up to him. We can come up and press it again, and you'll see they'll hand us the paw because they want us to pet them. How cool is that, ladies and gentlemen? But you'll notice we can't get the game back. It's completely froze, but we've still got some more to do. So yes, we can see the progress is going very, very well, and the animations really do sell it. So one thing I want is you'll notice that as I walk up to the dog and wake him up, we've kind of like ruined their wake. She'll never go back to sleep ever again. And well, we kind of wanted to go back to sleep because that's nice transition. We've worked all that way. We can't only have it do it once. That'd be weird. So in order to achieve this, what we need to basically do is start a timer whenever the dog has in an action or a state where they can actually fall back asleep. So what I mean by that, if we jump back to the anim graph and the state here, the animations, when they're sleeping, the dog's timer doesn't need to tell it to sleep. When it's waking up, it doesn't need to tell it to sleep. It's only when it's in idle do we need a timer to run to say, go to sleep, wake up kind of thing. But we need to start a timer to say, go back to sleep. And that's also, we need to be cancelling it if they're already going back to sleep for whatever reason, or they're barking or they're petting. So we kind of need a timer only on idle. And that is really easy to do. So I'm just going to jump back to the event graph here, and I'm going to come and create a new function down here called start sleep timer. And I'm going to drag off from here, and I'm going to do set timer by function name, and I'll call the function set sleep. And this will be set them to sleep. The time I'm going to drag off, and I'm just going to create a random float in range. If you want it to be a fixed time every 5 seconds they try to fall back asleep, that's fine. I'm going to set it randomly, so I'll say between 5 and 25. So every so often they'll just fall asleep or they'll just sit there waiting for a while. You could, in realistically terms, set this to be longer, but that's what I want to do. Next, I'm going to drag the return value and I'm going to promote it to a variable because we need to actually start and stop it. And I'm going to call it next sleep timer. That's the next time they're going to go to sleep. And the final thing I'm going to do here for efficiency is every time they need to sleep, we need to know they need to be in the idle animation state. So I'm actually just going to drag the animation, I'm going to drag the NPC animal in and do get, and I'll say set current state, and I'm just going to set it to idle. So if the timer is being told to start, they need to be in the idle phase. In theory, they can't get to that because you can't jump states like that, but it's a nice little protection. And now I can jump back to our event graph, and all we need to actually do now is tell it when to actually start the timer. So this idle here, when they're finished barking, we know we want to start the sleep timer, so we'll add it into there and connect it up. When the petting has finished, we know we need to start the timer, so we can connect it up, like so. When they finished waking up, because the players walked up, pressed it and walked away, we know we need to start the timer. So we've got 3 places we need to start the timer, and it's coincidentally the same places when we set it back to idle. Okay, so now that we've got our start sleep timer, we actually need to set them back to sleep. So I'm just going to come in, create a new function called set sleep, and just for clearing it up, I will drag the timer in and I will just do clear and invalidate, just in case something else tells it to go to sleep. We don't want the sleeping timer to keep going. And then the next thing we will do is drag the NPC animal in and do set state. And we'll set it to sleeping trans because that's how they're going to sleep. And then when sleeping trans is finished, and I've just realized we've not done the sleeping trans one. So when we come to the sleeping trans, if we double click the animation, we just need to add another one here, a notifier at the end to say, okay, go to sleep now. Move to the sleep state. So I will say sleep trans finished. We can save, and now I can close it off. I can come back to my event graph just down here, anim notify sleep state, sleep trans finished. And then from here, all we need to do is drag off NPC animal, set state to sleeping. There we go. The only other thing we need to do now is when the sleep timer is running, when we start the extra states here, such as barking, petting, or even starting to transition to sleeping, we need to tell it to cancel the timer we've set. Otherwise it'll go to sleep, or it'll try to bark, the timer will tell it to jump back to sleep, and it'll just mess up. So really easily, we're just going to create another function called clear sleep timer, and then I'm going to jump back to the set sleep, and I'm actually just going to copy this clear and invalidate part here, and where it says clear sleep timer, I'll just paste it in. So if we ever wanted to do anything else when we clear the sleep timer, we've got it in a nice one place. So we know when they call bark, we need to, when we call the anim notify bark, we need to clear the sleep timer. However, we don't actually want to do it on the bark. So if I jump into the bark animation, we actually call the bark 3 times. And if your animation's different, you might call it loads of times. You don't need to keep invalidating and clearing the timer. It's only a minor performance boost, but you don't need to do it. So I'm actually just going to come to the beginning here, and I'm just going to right click and create a new notify at the beginning called bark started. And now we can plug into this individual one rather than many. So I can right click anim notify underscore bark started. And then from here I can just call clear and clear sleep timer. There we go. A lot more efficient because it's not running 3 times to clear a timer that's been cleared already. The next thing we need to do is on the sleeping trans started and the sleep and the petting started as well. So just like before, jump back to the, I'll come into the pet, I'll double click the petting, and right at the beginning, before we play, I'll just right click, add notify, new notify, petting started. Think of it like a robot dog. We need to tell it in and out when things are happening. And then while I'm here, I'll also just come and do the sleeping trans. We've got the sleeping trans finished, so I'll just right click, add notify, new notify, and I'll do sleep trans started and save it. Now in our event graph, I'll just put it next to it all. So petting finished, I'll do right click, anim notify, petting started, and I'll drag off and just say clear sleep timer. And the final one is sleep trans started. There we go, and I can paste it in and we are all connected up. Looking good now, ladies and gentlemen. So now with this timer started, if we were to play it now, we can run up to the doggy, we can wake it up, and then you'll see once it's woken up, a timer will have started and it'll start ticking down randomly between 5 to 25. That dog should fall back asleep. There we go. Look at that, ladies and gentlemen. It's gone back to sleep. It's bored. It's like, nobody's talking to me. We can come up, we can wake it up, we can say, hello, Tifa. We can give her a good fuss. She'll go, give us a paw, and then she'll look really happy with herself. We feel much better, and then we can't do anything because we're not giving control back. But if we keep watching the doggy, it will eventually fall asleep again. There we go, and it's fallen back asleep because it's tired. How cool is that, ladies and gentlemen? I will admit the animations really do sell it. All we're doing is putting it together, but it does look really nice. So let's now work on some sounds for the animation to actually make it play the sounds. So on the NPC animal, this is where we create our variables for each of the sounds. So the first sound I'm going to do is actually the whine when the dog wants to be fussed. I'm just going to come in and I'll create a petting sound. And I'm going to come here and select a sound cue, and I'm going to make sure I tick soft object reference. Now we're ticking soft object reference instead of object reference because an object reference is always loaded in memory, even if you're not using it. So if you have 50 dogs and each of them have their own whine sounds or petting sounds, you'll have sounds loaded 50 times, which is not what you want. Soft object reference literally stores a pointer to that sound, so it doesn't exist in memory yet. It's just here's the location when you are ready for it. So that's why it's often much better to use soft references instead of, well, I guess hard references. So that's the petting sound here, and what I'm going to do is come in and duplicate it again, and I'll add a barking sound because we know we've got a barking sound. And if you've got any other sounds like sleeping, etc., you could also do those sounds as well. But for me, that's good enough. So I'm just going to come to the petting sound, and I know I've got a whine cue somewhere. If I come into my sounds here, I've already set a doggies folder up, and I've got a cries, which is what it's called, and I've got these sounds. And you might think, why is the dog crying? I don't know. My dog whines when she wants me to fuss her, so that's what I'm going with. And all I've done is highlighted all the different whines I want, right-click, create a single cue, and it's created this cue here. And it's automatically added a random node, so every time I click play, you can see it'll just play a random sound every time. So yeah, so in the petting sound, I can come and if I now select my cue, I can just click the plus button and it'll add it in. And I can do the exact same for the barking one, so I've got a barking one, and it plays the bark sound. I've only made sure that the barking is single barks, because then we can time it up with the dog's animation. So if a dog opens its mouth, it's not going to bark twice. It'll open, bark, close, open, bark, close. So we need to make sure we've got that catered for. And that's the sound part there. Now all we need to do is tell it to play it. So when we come in here, let's do the barking one first. So I'll select all of this and give us a bit more room. So we know where the sound is. So it's on the NPC animal, so we can drag that in. I can drag off from the NPC animal and I can do get bark sound like so. And then from here, I can drag off and I can do load async asset like that. Don't click blocking because blocking will freeze the current frame until the sound is loaded. Often very quick, but if you've got a high intensity fast game, it's not going to be working. So just click async load asset so we can do other things if we need to. And then once it's finished, it will come out here. We can cast it to a sound cue. Make sure the arrow is on the completed, not the top one. The top one will go off and run straight away. And once we've got the sound cue, then we can just come off here and do play sound at location, and we'll plug it in like so. The location will be our NPC animal, and I will just do get actor location, and plug it in. And that's it. That's how we play a sound. Obviously, I can tidy this up outside the tutorial more as well. So barking started, that's when it's initiated. There will bark, 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 and then it'll call bark finished. And where's petting started? Petting started is here. So we clear the timer, and then we come in and then we say, right, now start your whining sounds. So the whining sounds, I'll come off here, I'll do petting, get petting sound, and we can plug it in. And again, that's all we need to do. Then if we run it and try it again, when we run up to them, we haven't got barking set up yet. We'll work on that in a moment. But if I wake her up, go on, Teeth, and then I pet her, and she's telling us she wants a stroke. Obviously, we can get some better sounds. They were just some ones I had on me at the time, and we can see we can stroke the dog. Perfect. So next, let's work on getting barking done, because we actually need it in. Now, this is really easy to do, but we just have to mess around with the collision profiles a moment. So I'm going to come in and grab the dialogue trigger here, and I'm actually just going to hit Control D or Command D to duplicate it, and I'll call it Speak Sound Trigger. I do keep meaning to call it speak instead of bark, because then you can reuse it on multiple animals, but it's fine. And I'm going to center align it into the dog here, and I'll keep the height where it is. But I'm actually just going to set the sphere to a bit bigger, like 64, maybe 100. Yeah. So if you're in the dog's radius, they'll randomly pick whether they want to bark at you, but only if they're awake. So now I can come down here, and I can go to the on component begin overlap. From the other actor, I can drag off and do cast first person character, or cast it to whatever your player is. And then from here, this is where we now generate our random bull. So I'm going to hold B and just click branch in and connect that up. And we want to right click here and do random bull with, I'll just do random bull. If you want it weighted, like you might want them 60% of the time to bark, 40% not, choose the with weight. But I'm just going to do random bull 50-50 straight. Will the dog bark at you or not? But one thing I have forgot, if we just drag this across, the only other thing I'm going to say is I'm going to add another branch in here and connect with true up. And I'm going to say if the current state is idle, because that's the only time we want the dog to bark. Because it's going to be weird if a dog barks at you and it's fast asleep. That's not how it works. So I'll click idle. So only if they're idle and the random bull, which we could technically bring down here and convert to an and for efficiency. There we are. So only if the dog is in idle and the random bull say so, then they will play the bark sound, which is as simple, for us luckily, as setting the state, the bark. That's simple, because our animation graph will pick up and take care of it. Now, the reason I've said we need to change to the collision profile is you will notice now if I run up, I can wake the dog up from very, very far away. Nowhere near am I near to the dog, and I can do it over here as well. That's not right. And the reason it's doing it is the line trace on my player is actually hitting the big sphere and saying, right, you can wake them up now. And that's not what we want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down to the collision profiles down here, and I'm going to make sure this is set to overlap only pawn, and I'm actually just going to hit the custom option here. Then all I'm going to do is set mine to world static, and that's all I need to do on mine. And you can figure out which one you need to do by opening your player and looking at your line trace. So this will be completely different. If you're on third person, you won't need to worry about this so much. You'll have a different way to interact with them. But for me, I have this here, which only checks pawns and world dynamic objects, such as items that are spawned in the world. If something is marked as world static, then it won't hit it and it'll just ignore it, which is exactly what we want. We only want the dog to know us and potentially bark. So now if I run up to it, you'll see I have to get back up close again. It won't do it. So I can come up close, I can interact her, I'll wake her up and she'll be like, hello, I'll walk away. But this time if I walk back up, there you go. Yeah, she's barking at us. How cool's that? But sometimes, oh, it did it again. Do it again. There we go. She's not barked that time. Perfect. So that, ladies and gentlemen, we have a dog that you can wake up, you can pet, they will bark at you. The only other things we need to do is fixing the camera so it actually looks at them. So you'll see if I walk up, I can look up in the air, just like, you know, above her collider, just press E, she'll wake up. There's no interaction at all. I can pet her just by looking up. We need to look at the doggy. So that's one we're going to solve now with the camera. So I'm going to jump back to my NPC animal. I will jump into the event graph. And under all of this, I'll just create a new event called add custom event. And I will say start camera. And this is where we're going to actually transition the camera down to look at the dog. If you've watched my GTA shop video, you will have a very similar camera. This will mainly only work for the first person camera. If you have a third person camera, you can try it. You might have to change some of the values though. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to right click and do get player controller. And then from here, again, if you're on multiplayer, you'll have to figure out your index. And I will do get control rotation. This will get what current rotation the camera has and what our input is telling it to be. and I will drag this up and promote it to a variable. This variable we called backup look at rotation, and this is basically caching where the current control rotation is, so when we reset the camera back, it will be in the exact position what we left it at. So almost a seamless gameplay. From here, I'm going to drag off and do play. I'm going to do add timeline, and I'll just call this start camera timeline. Inside here, I'm going to double click and I'll click the track at the top. So we need to figure out how long we want this float track to be. So I'll just call this time, and I will say we'll fade in over 0.5. So over 0.5, so half a second, it will look down at the dog, smoothly looping into place. I will come to the very beginning, right click, add keyframe, and I will do the exact same at the end. That I will highlight the first one, I'll set the time to 0 and the value to 0. Then the end one, I will set the time to 1 and the value to 1. Oh no, the time to 0.5, sorry, because we've only got half of one. And now with this, back to the event graph, we can actually get this time and it will go between 0 and 1. So as this timer goes up here, the value will go 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, all the way to number 1, the value 1, and the value 1 will be the camera has transitioned from the previous to the new place. So I'm going to drag in the backup look at rotation, and I'll drag off and do lerp. And then in the lerp, all it does is transition between 2 points based on the alpha. So if the alpha is 0, it'll be at A. If it's at 1, it'll be at B. I'll take the shortest path. We'll plug the time into the alpha. And as this runs over 0.5 seconds, it'll go alpha 0, 0.1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to 1. And this alpha will smoothly rotate the camera. Next, I'm going to come back and grab the get player controller. And I'm just going to drag up and do set control rotation and plug it into our new lerped rotation. Plug it into the update so it runs constantly. There we go. Drag this down to make it a bit neater. And now all we need to do is give it the B value for what we want it to actually rotate to. So drag in the player character, drag off and do get first person camera. And of course, if you're on third person or whatever, just make sure you try to figure out the right camera. You might need some different logic. Then I'll drag off here and do get world location. So this is the camera's position in the world. And I will drag off and do find look at rotation. So what it's going to do is say, here's the start position of the camera. This is where it needs to look at. Convert it to get the correct rotation. It does all the maths for you. It's fantastic. And then the only other thing we need to do, we need to give it a target. And we know the target is the dog. So I just need it to look in the center here. That arrow will probably be more than fine because when the dog's in idle, it'll be sat up. So I'm going to right click and do get actor location. And I'll plug it in. And then finally, we can just get the return value and plug it in to B like that. And that is how we start the camera from transitioning. So I will come in and comment it and say start camera trans looking at dog. And now that we can compile that back in the animation graph, when we start petting, which is petting started here, I'm just going to drag all of this across a little bit. There we go. And bring the NPC animal back. I will just drag up and do camera start. And we can plug it in and we can plug it in like so. So now this time when we walk up to the dog, it will take over the camera and force it to look down at the dog. You won't have a choice. And no matter if you look at it backwards or whatever, you will have to look at the dog. So you'll wake up, it can still move. But if I look at the dog this way and press E, it rotates and looks at the dog because we've just interacted with the dog. How cool's that? Super cool. So the last thing we need to do now is give the player back control. So we need to rotate the camera back to where it was, and then we need to unlock the player's control so they can do whatever they need. So I'm actually just going to come up and copy all of this because the majority of it is what we need again. And this time I'm going to call it end camera. The backup look at rotation we don't want. What we actually want to do is have another variable, unfortunately, but it's fine, called temp look at rotation. And I will plug this in and plug that into the play. I will rename this timeline to end camera timeline. And we know we want it to be 0.5 when it ends again, so that's fine. We want it to set it all there. However, this time B won't exist anymore, so we can get rid of all of this here. And instead, we're going to put B as the backup look at rotation. Because if you remember, on the start, we stored what the player's current camera rotation was. And we stuck it in backup location and we didn't do anything with it. Whereas here, we're seeing now it needs to end back up at this place. And where does it start from? Our new temp location. You might be thinking, why don't we just use get control rotation and plug it into there? And the reason is, if you plug get control rotation into there, every single time this timeline comes, it's going to get the current control rotation, set it to something different, come back and set it again. So it'll just be reusing the updated value every time. The lerp won't be able to compensate where it needs to go. So you need to have a fixed value like this and say, this is your fixed starting point, this is your fixed end point, lerp between it. And now that we've done that, we can drag off from the finished here. And this is where we start giving the player control back. So I can so I can copy the get player controller and paste it here. From here, I can drag off and do set input mode game only. Now, if you've got a third person game or some type of game where you need the mouse cursor in the game, don't set it back to game only, set it back to UI and game only. That'll allow you to retain functionality. But for me, it's a first person game. I don't need the mouse cursor when I'm in the game, so that's fine for me. Next, at the very start of petting, we told the character that they were busy, so I need to unbusy them. So I'll just paste the is busy node in here, and I will drag in my player character into the target and just untick it so they're not busy, they can now interact with things again. Then I'm just going to come in and clear out the player character variable, because if you have multiple people trying to pet it, that will prevent it, and it will also free up some memory. And then the final thing I'll do is just set the state back to idle. No, I don't need to do that thing. And now all we need to do is jump back into the animation graph, and when the petting is finished, we'll start the sleep timer, which will tell them to be idle. And then the only other thing we need to do is grab the NPC animal and just say finish the camera end camera, because we have finished. On the petting, just move it up around the wrong one, and we'll just say end camera. So one slight bug fix I'm just going to solve is I'm just going to make sure these are plugged in play from start, because it appears that the timeline is staying active. So I will click in, we will test it one more time. So we'll test it now. We can run up, we can see the doggy fast asleep. You can add sleeping sounds, that's really easy to do. I can wake them up and say hello girl, wake them up, and we'll they're barking at us because we walked up to them. I didn't expect them to do that. We can see their tails wagging because they're idle. Oh, she froze. Okay, we might have to loop the animation. If I press E to pet, you'll see she'll whine, she'll lift a paw up, we'll stroke her, good girl. And then if I look off to the side and do it, you'll see the camera will fade round, fuss the dog, and then we'll fade back. Like that. Yes, look at that, ladies and gentlemen. And for the final icing on the cake, the dog in a moment will fall asleep. There we go, and she's now fell back asleep to sleep until we next run up to her and wake her up and give her a fuss. There we go. Now for the little fix with the looping of the animation, all we're going to do is come back to the animations graph, jump into idle, double click dog sitting, and just make sure loop is ticked like that. All that means is when this finishes, it'll just go back to the beginning, like so. Nice and easy. And just to prove that we've made it super generic, I'm actually going to grab the little doggy over here. I haven't got anyone who will sit, but all I do is I'll just duplicate her over to here, and then I will find her name. I'll give it a different name. We'll say this one could be a male, so we'll say Sir Woofington. And then I will grab the mesh, and we actually have a robot dog, which is cool. So I'll pick robot dog like that. All the same animations work. You'll notice I can't change the sounds, so I'll just jump back to NPC animal. I'll take the 2 sound cues as that. For the rotations, we can actually just come and tick private just to hide them away. We don't need anything having access to them. There we go. And now I can come and change the sounds here. And what I have got is I actually have some robot versions. So you see a normal dog, like so. What I've done